Hey, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. We're going to get started in just a couple minutes here. As is tradition with our webinars, we'll typically start a minute or two after the scheduled time to give everyone time to scramble to their computer when they get the calendar notification, to update Zoom if they need to, possibly re-download it. So we typically start around, 01 or 02 for these things. Hey, Eric and Alyssa, how's it going?
Doing all right. What about yourself, Jim?
Very good. Excited about the return of, actual warm weather to the Philadelphia area. That's been nice.
I'm just excited to be doing this instead of watching the Sixers tonight.
Anything but watching the Sixers, yes.
To be fair, Eric, I was expecting you to open with cold weather. What's that? We don't have that in Florida.
No, you don't. It's true. I'm glad you said it for me.
I do my best.
You can tell he's already in the portion of spring where the air conditioning is just on all the time because he's got the quarter zip on.
I'm just wearing it for the company logo, guys. Come on.
Love it. All right, for everyone who just joined, we're going to get started in just a minute or two. We like to give people a little extra grace period to fill in for these webinars.
Did we get our May the 4th be with you social media post up for the SAT on Saturday?
It is scheduled and it is fantastic and honey, and I cannot wait for both of you to see it. We are exactly that kind of nerd. We saw that the SAT was on May the 4th and had to. Our Pi Day social media post is always on March 14th at exactly 1:59 p.m. because if you're going to do it, you gotta do it 100%.
Exactly. All right, so why don't we jump into it for today? So welcome everyone to our What's Next? So You're Finishing 10th Grade webinar. Very exciting time. The school year is winding down. Students may not feel that way yet because this is really the time of year everything is most acute from an academic standpoint. But we're excited to coach you through the next steps that students should be thinking about heading into the summer and into that pivotal 11th grade year. So we always like to kick off these kinds of webinars by talking about the factors that are really in a student's control in college admissions. Apologies to our repeat attenders who hear me say this, maybe on a monthly basis at this point. But when it comes to what a student can really control to help their college admissions chances, we break it down to 5 main things: grades and academic rigor, standardized tests like the SAT, ACT, AP, and IB exams, letters of recommendation from teachers and counselors, extracurricular activities, and then the written components of applications. And there's more that goes into college admissions than these 5 factors. It's much more complicated than that. What other students at your high school are doing, your demographic information, your zip code, etc. All of that is going to factor in some way or another. But these are the 5 things that students can really invest their time and energy into improving for themselves. And that's why we focus on these things in our advice to families, and it'll be the guiding force throughout tonight's presentation. So with that said, I'm here to talk about mainly the academic factors of college admissions. And so the first thing is to remind you that grades and rigor are traditionally the most important factors in college admissions. So historically, they've been the most important factor by far. You can think of the academic profile of an application as sort of the front page. And while, people like to say, don't judge a book by its cover, of course, if you've ever been to a bookstore, everyone does. And this is that cover page. So your junior year grades are going to be the most significant grades. And that's for a very simple reason. Junior year you, students, is closer to college you than sophomore year or freshman year you was. So this is the last full year of grades that colleges are going to see before they make their admissions decisions. And that's why it's really important to be ready to do your absolute best next year. Now, grades are a necessary aspect of selective college admissions, but we can't necessarily rely on them proving the point on their own because of grade inflation. And this is something we talk about a lot because it's important for families to know in this process. But high school GPAs are quite different from what they were, parents, when you were in school. I have here the GPA spread for the University of Pittsburgh, and you can see 70% of the students admitted to the main campus of the University of Pittsburgh were, over a 4.0 GPA. And this is a weighted GPA. I should mention that first. So you get a little bit of an extra bump for honors and AP courses. So it's not like they were literally perfect GPAs. You can have a B and still be over a 4.0 in a weighted system. But the point is that excellent grades, an A average, a GPA over 4.0, these aren't necessarily distinguishing factors for students anymore when it comes to selective admissions. And that's important to keep in mind. When I mentioned that high school grades are quite different from when parents were in school, I mean that very literally. I have here the percentage of the percentage of college freshmen who had at least a 90% high school average from 1965 to 2022. And we can see that over 80% of students have an A average now. So while great grades are going to be necessary for college, they're not necessarily going to be what gets you in on their own or much of a distinguishing factor because grades are very clustered at the top end of the spectrum. So course selection is one way that students can distinguish themselves in this process. Essentially, more selective courses are going to be viewed more favorably by more selective colleges. When it comes to course selection, though, there is no one-size-fits-all advice. So you should not misconstrue what I'm saying to mean everyone should take the most challenging courses that they can convince their school counselor to allow them to register for. Certainly not. The decisions for course selection next year should pretty much be made by now. Sometimes you're able to make adjustments late in the year, but it's going to be rare that that kind of thing is necessary. Hopefully you made great decisions in February or earlier this year when you had to make those calls. The main thing to keep in mind from a course selection standpoint at this point is just be honest with yourself early next year if it's time to drop. Sometimes there will be a period in the year where you can drop a course without it showing up on your transcript. Meaning, if you were to stay with a course through a marking period or through a semester, then you would have a grade for the first semester for that course. And then if you drop down a level in your math class or you dropped out of AP physics into a standard level physics, then at that point, colleges would see on your transcript you had a semester at the higher level and then the rest of the year at a lower level. So making an honest decision early on if you feel like an adjustment's necessary for courses is important. And so you want to just enter next year, making sure that you're setting yourself up to succeed. Of course, you should be challenging yourself. But if you're absolutely running into a brick wall with a certain course where it's eating up so much of your time and attention that you're not able to dedicate yourself properly to the extracurricular activities you care about, to your other coursework, that's when it makes sense to kind of pull back, take the pedal off the gas and drop down a level, and better sooner than later. I do want to mention that if your only goal in the world is to be admitted to the most highly selective colleges possible, my first piece of advice is please reevaluate your priorities. My second piece of advice is you really do need to take the most challenging course load that your school offers and do very well in it. And that is really only true of that most selective tier of colleges, but it does warrant saying for the students who have those very lofty goals. So we're going to finish each of our 5 factors with a what's next slide to kind of summarize, okay, end of 10th grade, what should we be thinking about in terms of the steps to come? Number 1 is do your absolute best for the rest of the school year, especially on those final exams, any AP or IB exams you may be taking. If you have to make any necessary adjustments to your 11th grade courses, do it sooner rather than later. School counselors are often not very accessible in the summer. So if you're making a decision after school lets out, you might be waiting a month for an email reply that you would get in 24 hours, 48 hours during the school year. And then finally, approach this pivotal junior year that's coming up with a clear view of its importance. There's no reason to psych yourself out. It's still high school. It's the same thing you've been doing for the past 2 years. It's not like a total shift in what's actually happening. But you do need to realize that this year's grades and academic performance are going to be scrutinized more deeply than those earlier years of high school were. With that said, I'll kick it to Alyssa to talk about letters of recommendation.
So as Jim astutely noted, one of the most important things in the weeks and months to come is entering 11th grade with a sense of its importance when it comes to in the classroom work. And while, of course, that's true when it comes to your grades are the most important factor of your college application, your junior year grades, more important than any other year. One of the other reasons why a student wants to enter 11th grade strong is because these are more often than not going to be the teachers that they're going to ask for letters of recommendation, which is in an indirect way, one of the factors that a student has under their control. While of course, students are not the ones who are writing the letters, those are being written by teachers and by counselors. They are the ones in charge of shaping the relationships behind those letters. And that becomes crucially important to give admissions officers that third-party insight into students from their educators and counselors. It's very easy for a student to say, for instance, I am an excellent critical thinker, but it carries a lot more weight when it is the AP macroeconomics teacher who is writing about how this particular student does show critical thinking or the ability to work with others or any of the other academic soft skills that are crucial to success in college that aren't going to show up, for instance, on the transcript. So I gave you a little bit of a preview here of who should students ask in this case. For the vast majority of the time, it is going to be junior year core subject teachers. When we define a core subject, it's important to note that most colleges and universities consider, of course, not just math, science, history, and English to be a core subject, but foreign language as well. So students are going to want to ask core subject junior year teachers preferably, but above all, more than anything else, asking teachers who know them and who love them. This might even supersede having a great grade in that class. Of course, having the great grade is perfect, but if the only thing that a teacher can say is, well, they were a very good student and they got 100s on my tests and they have an A, well, your transcript's going to say that. Sometimes it can be even more useful to have a teacher where you may have gotten a B speak to the other intangible qualities that show up in a classroom. When they were struggling, they came to me for help. They did test corrections. They asked questions. They went out of their way to try and succeed. And maybe it resulted in a B, but a hard-won contextualized B can mean a lot. One of the other questions that we get is going to be about those optional recommenders. So typically you're going to send 1 to 2 teacher recommendations, your counselor recommendation, but there are often opportunities to send a third recommendation from someone who isn't a teacher or someone who is a teacher in a different year. For these, you don't want to overburden an admissions officer with letters that are going to repeat something that might have already been said in another context, but there are specific moments where it can help elucidate a factor of a student that wouldn't show up anywhere else in the application. And Jim, I think you had one of those instances happen when you were applying to college, right?
That's right. Yeah. So I did opt to use an optional third recommender for college applications. And so my story was my main extracurricular activity in high school was track and field. And I was a late bloomer physically. So all it said in the activities section of my Common App was track and field for 3 years, JV, JV, JV. I had no accolades, didn't win anything, dealt with injuries, all this stuff. Don't write your college essay about sports injuries, by the way, but that's not for another year, because that's what I did. And somehow I got away with it, but you should not. Anyway, because of this, I actually was in a leadership position on that track and field team. I would help our coach run the timing system at several meets, not just our own meets, but we would run the timing system for other schools' meets. I was a mentor to younger students on the team. This was back when it was legal to leave a student in charge of the weight room, or maybe it wasn't, but my coach did anyway, and I would supervise the weight room. And so these are all, basically ways to contextualize, hey, this thing that I've been doing for 2-3 hours after school every day for the past 3 years, I wasn't just there to mess around and get a line on my resume. I was actually working very hard at it. And on top of all of this, my head track and field coach was also my 9th grade social studies teacher. And what he taught was world history, and I wanted to study ancient history. That was the history course that was most relevant to what I actually wanted to study. And so because of that sort of double whammy of context, where he was a core academic teacher from a younger year of high school, and at the same time, someone who could speak to leadership qualities I was showing in an extracurricular activity that didn't on its own look very good on paper, that was why I opted to use that third letter of recommendation, because it truly added something unique to my application.
So when it comes to letters of recommendation, the what's next is truly going into 11th grade sort of prepared to succeed, to build relationships with those junior teachers, both because it will set you up for success in the classroom, but also because it will give you great options when it comes to asking for letters of recommendation and moving far, far into the future at this point, 12 months from now, or maybe a little bit earlier. Once you've built those relationships, make sure that you ask for the letter of recommendation before the end of junior year. Teachers want to do the absolute best by their students. They want to write the utter best letters of recommendation possible, and asking early, gives you a better chance of having the teacher say yes. Many teachers will cap the number of letters of recommendation they write, so that they can give every student the attention they deserve. But it also gives teachers the chance to write over the summer and take their time to write exactly the kind of letter of recommendation that you deserve. And now, having given you a little bit of a break from numbers and charts, I'm going to hand you all back to Jim.
All right. So standardized testing is the next factor we're going to explore here. And it's always important at the beginning of this conversation to provide a little context. So what is the point of standardized testing? The number one reason colleges use it at all is because it is very effective at predicting student success at a college. It's even more effective when used in conjunction with the GPA. We mentioned that grades are inflated, and it leads to a situation where grades are compressed, meaning there's less numerical difference between GPAs now than there was in the past. And so standardized testing provides third-party validation of a student's grades and academic performance to basically be able to show the college, I demonstrated that I picked up the skills that my grades say that I did, to a third party that, parents can't call and yell at, that aren't influenced by human factors and just kind of objective and standard. Standardized testing also allows colleges to compare a student with their local context. Part of what's going to travel with your high school transcript is something called a school profile. And that school profile is going to include certain information about your high school, which would include things like the average SAT and/or ACT score from your high school, what AP courses are offered, the percentage of students from your school that end up going on to four-year universities, and a lot of other information that helps provide context. And so colleges know that, you know, the same score from two different high schools could tell them something different. The final thing that is really important to note here is that standardized testing is part of a holistic review process. So even people who love standardized testing like me, I know I'm that sicko, that's how you end up doing this for a living. No one believes that a student can be distilled down to one number and that that's any kind of accurate representation of who they are. The standardized test score is one very specific number that can help colleges do a very specific thing, which is predict the likelihood of a student to succeed at college and validate their, you know, grades with a third-party standard. We talked about grade inflation, and here's our graph. If we look at ACT scores from 1990 to 2022, we can see that they've barely changed at all. And I use the ACT here because the SAT has redesigned its tests and changed its scoring scale several times over that same time period, so the graph is a lot messier. But the SAT is normalized in the same way and provides the same level of standardization as the ACT. The ACT, just the scores are on the same scale from the whole time period, so the graph is a lot smoother. So in other words, in an era where grades are not really distinguishing students very much one way or the other, standardized test scores still can. Now, test optional has been the buzzword of college admissions pretty much since 2020, when every college had to go test optional because of test center closures during the pandemic. But we're starting to see, especially this year, a changing tide in the way that universities are talking about test optional admissions and standardized testing. So I have a quote here from Emory's Dean of Admissions who says that we're not as trusting of GPA these days. Students are trying their hardest, but grades are definitely inflated and not as connected to true class performance as they used to be. This is in the context of him talking about the fact that Emory's weighing AP exam scores more heavily than they have in the past and more heavily than high school grades. Now, that's one university's policy. I don't mean to tell you all that at every school in the country, grades or APs are more important than GPA, because that's not true. Grades are, at most universities, the most important thing. But we see more and more people in college admissions on the college side being able to speak out about this. We saw similar language in the announcements of several of the Ivy League schools who went back to requiring standardized testing this spring. And so we're starting to see a sort of return to favor for standardized testing. Now, essentially, you're going to see three different standardized testing policies out there in the world. There's test optional, which is going to be most colleges and universities at this point. Some colleges have gone back to being test required. Several of the Ivies, many of the large Southern state schools, and some other highly selective institutions. Generally speaking, your test required schools are typically either highly selective or Southern state schools. That's the category of school that is the most likely to be test required. At the same time, not every Southern state school requires standardized testing, and not every Ivy requires standardized testing. I believe we're at 50% in the Ivy League right now. So the third policy is test blind or score 3, and this is really predominantly a West Coast phenomenon. The California State and University of California systems are big examples of this. And these schools won't even use test scores if you submit them. So these are sort of the three main buckets of standardized testing policies you're going to see out there. The thing is that the policy in the middle, right? You have test required on one extreme, test blind on the other. Test optional, though, is a spectrum, meaning it's an umbrella term that covers a wide array of institutional philosophies on the importance of standardized testing. So what test optional really means is just that the college will accept your application fee and review your application, whether or not it includes a test score. The fact that a college is test optional does not, on its own, say anything about your likelihood of success with or without a test score. So there are some colleges out there that admit over 70% of their students with test scores, even though they are test optional. Duke and Penn would be two popular examples. Ohio State is another. There are other test optional schools out there that admit fewer than 30% of their students with test scores. So University of Washington is an example, Pepperdine, a small liberal arts school on the West Coast. And so generally speaking, Duke and Pepperdine have very different views on how relevant these standardized testing scores are to their evaluations of students. But if you were to look up a listicle of, what colleges are test optional for current 10th graders, both of them are going to be on the list. I should have used Penn and Pepperdine because they might even be right next to each other in alphabetical order. But they mean totally different things. So it's important to not just kind of take at face value the fact that a college is test optional as an invitation not to test. And in fact, even at the schools like University of Washington and Pepperdine, if you apply with a strong score, it's still something that's going to help you there. It's just that you're more likely to, have success without a test score there than you would be at a Duke or a Penn or an Ohio State or other of the schools who are admitting high percentages of their students with test scores. Another thing to keep in mind is that there are many colleges that are test optional except for certain ifs, ands, and buts, we'll say. So most colleges are test optional except for homeschooled students. You saw the graph of school grades. Now imagine what's happened to mom's grades over that same time period. Then there are colleges who are test optional only for certain majors or programs. We worked with an Elon applicant this fall. She was applying for nursing. She toured campus in August, found out that Elon, in fact, does require scores for their nursing program. Not overall, they're test optional, but for nursing, they require scores. And then she was scrambling to complete her standardized testing in time for her application deadlines. Some colleges are test optional, but only if your GPA is above a certain threshold. So Auburn is an example of this, 3.6. If your GPA is below that, then you must submit a test score. And then finally, there are colleges who are applying imputed scores to students. And what that means is that they are essentially assuming a test score from the students who are applying without one. Now, if we think about what scores are missing from a college's pool, right? They have their historical data of pre-pandemic. What did our whole array of test scores look like? And of course, after the pandemic now, half of the scores aren't coming through anymore in a test optional environment. They are not assuming that the higher half of scores are not coming through. So they're assigning scores to students using big data, but starting from a range, which is the lower half of what they were seeing in the first place. So Cornell is the only school that has gone on record about this, and that was a big part of the reason they actually went back to requiring test scores this spring, because they found that, oh wait, in our policy, we're actually kind of using them anyway. But there, we're led to believe that there are other colleges doing similar things to this, and it is to a certain extent just common sense. If the score is not there, we can assume it's below the median, because if it was above the median, students would be submitting them. So that's something to keep in mind as well. So the bottom line when it comes to the test optional landscape is that a strong score is still an admissions asset, and that's going to be true no matter how optional a test score is, although it won't be true at test blind schools. The more selective your goals are, and you can think of this as anything really with an acceptance rate below 15%, the more important your score becomes. Even if they're a genuinely test optional school, which few of the students or few of the schools in that range are, but some are, then the score becomes more important, because when you're applying to those highly selective institutions, you want every single point that can possibly go in your favor. Having a strong score is going to expand your options, both in terms of schools that you can apply to, schools that are test required, schools that are test strongly preferred, like the Dukes and Penns and Ohio States of the world, and because some colleges require scores for certain merit-based scholarships, even if they're test optional. So if you remember Pepperdine from a few slides ago, I believe they are 28% of their students admitted with test scores. but their best scholarship requires standardized test scores from the SAT or ACT. And then finally, and this is an important point in this conversation as well, and something I haven't spoken to yet, so I do want to emphasize this. If the amount of time and effort and potentially financial investment it would take for your family to get that strong standardized test score that would be an asset in admissions would just be too much, to the point that it would not be worth it, and you decide upfront, I think I should go test optional, there are plenty of options available to you. Colleges that are genuinely test optional. So I'm not sitting here trying to scare everyone into thinking you better get a 1600 or else. That's absolutely not the case. Everyone is different. Some students just don't translate well to this timed multiple choice format of the standardized test. And there are options for you, but your options will be limited. And it's just a decision you have to make with your eyes open when you're making that decision. So with that said, it's time to talk a little bit about the tests, and I'll keep this mercifully brief for you all on this beautiful spring evening. So the digital SAT is a new format of tests. So any 10th grade parents who are here and maybe had a student 2 years older or older than that, they would have taken a paper version of the SAT. No longer. The SAT is now digital. 10th graders, if you took the PSAT in the fall, this is the format you took. If you took it this spring, this is the format you took. So essentially you have 2 sections each of reading and writing and math, and you get a score out of 1600. So parents, it's the same old SAT scoring you're used to, 800 reading and writing, 800 math, for a total score out of 1600. Some of the biggest challenges on the digital SAT are the limited annotation tools. When you compare with the paper test, when you can write whatever you want, wherever you want on that page, the SAT does let you highlight and cross out answers and certain things, but it's limiting because the application can only do what the application can do, as opposed to a pencil on a paper can do whatever you want. The verbal questions of the SAT tend to be on the more challenging end. The vocabulary level of the test tends to be higher, and that's one of the most difficult things for students to prep for, is vocabulary knowledge in particular, because for all the SAT words you can study, you just have to get lucky with having studied the words that appear on your specific test. And finally, the fact that the test is adaptive. And what do I mean by that? So the digital SAT is adaptive, which essentially means that I'll just use math as an example throughout here, but reading and writing works the same way. You get your first math module, and every student who takes the test that day gets a math module 1 of equal difficulty. Your performance in math module 1 dictates whether you're fed into a lower scoring module 2 or a higher scoring module 2. And that will dictate, to a degree, where in the final score curve you can get. So in other words, you're typically going to get a higher score testing into the harder second module than you would be able to getting into the lower second module, though that's not always true, and there is some overlap in the middle. A student who did really poorly in module 1 but then does really well in the easier version of the module 2, versus a student who did just barely good enough in module 1 and then did really poorly in the harder module 2. So it can have some overlap there. But this adaptive nature of the test can mess with students' heads sometimes. So when I say it's a challenge on the test, it's not a challenge insofar as it should affect the way you take the test. At the end of the day, the way to get the highest score is to answer more questions correctly. And that really hasn't changed. There's no secret strategy to, oh, well, should I try to get the easier second module so I can ace it? Or no, absolutely not. Don't get questions wrong on purpose at any point when you take this test, please. There is no kind of secret sauce to it, but it can kind of play with students' minds. The other thing about the digital SAT is just that the adaptive scoring also goes question by question. And what I mean by that is that different questions can have different weights on a student's score. So for instance, you could get a question wrong on this test and lose 0 points from your score because they include experimental questions in the test. And you can get a question wrong and lose up to 40 points from your score. Now that's on the extreme end of what we've seen. Usually it's going to be 10 or 20, sometimes 30, rarely 40. But it makes it a higher variance test, because every little mistake can affect you more or less than before. Whereas on the ACT, the first question you miss does the same thing to your score no matter what question it is. With all that said, let's talk a little bit about the ACT. So the ACT is very similar to the SAT, but it's taken on paper still. ACT is piloting a digital version of the test. If you're an international student, you'll take the test in a digital format. If you're in a state that administers the ACT to every student during the school year, then you'll take the test in a digital format. But if you're just signing up on act.org to take the test on a Saturday, then you're taking a paper test unless you're randomly selected to do a like test run of the digital test, which some students are being offered right now. The sections of the test are similar with one big difference. So the English and reading sections of the ACT correspond pretty closely to the skills of SAT reading and writing. The English section is a writing section, which is to say mostly rules of grammar and some rhetoric and composition. But instead of just math on that other half, the ACT has a science section. The science section of the ACT is not a science test. It tests the student's ability to essentially read a description of a scientific experiment, look at data that's presented with that experiment, and draw conclusions. Except that your test prep tutor is going to tell you you don't have to read the passages, actually. But you do have to go to those passages to find information. And so ACT Science is sort of like a very quantitative reading section, where it's going to test your fluency with data, ability to read graphs and tables quickly and efficiently. The scoring of the ACT is very different from the SAT. It's scored out of 36. Each of those sections is scored out of 36, and then your scores are averaged to an overall score out of 36 instead of being added like on the SAT. And the biggest challenges that students will tend to report from the ACT are one, timing. The ACT asks you to do more questions with less time per question than the SAT. So that can be difficult for students who are kind of slower, more methodical workers. Not that methodical workers can't do well on that ACT, it's just that that's the challenge. Fatigue is a factor on the ACT. It is a longer test, and because you're needing to work at a faster pace and go longer, students usually report being more tired at the end of an ACT. And then specifically, if you're trying to get a perfect score in the math section, the topics of ACT math rotate more frequently. We actually just got the official copy of the April ACT today, and they tested a topic in statistics that had never appeared on the test before, or at least knowledge of two very specific vocabulary words. Conceptually, it was something that was in the bounds of the test, something that we do teach our students, but not with these two specific vocabulary words that you needed to know for that particular question. So you're going to get more curveballs in the very most difficult questions of the ACT. So that's something to consider. Now, with all that said, how do you decide which one to take? Students are like, well, that's easy. The SAT is shorter and I get to take it on a screen, so I'll take that one. Not so fast. So the best way to make this decision is to try both tests and compare your scores. If one score is far stronger than the other, then it's pretty straightforward. You just go with the one you have a big head start on. If your scores are close, then a more nuanced view is going to be necessary. Now, we're going to send out an SAT, ACT diagnostic test to all the attendees that are here tonight. If you registered for the Zoom webinar, then you'll be getting that. And so we'll send this out to anyone who would like to take it at home. But we'll give our recommendation for which of the two tests is likely to be a better fit for you based on how you perform on those two. When to take the official test. This is something you should be thinking about now. And essentially, if you are going to be finished with Algebra 2 and Geometry by the end of 10th grade, then the goal would be to take it early in junior year to try to be done by winter break so that you can focus on academics in that spring of junior year, which is going to be your most academically intense time of high school. If you think you're busy now, sophomores, next year will be busier. If you are taking Algebra 2 or Geometry or the equivalent integrated math course, more on that in a moment, during junior year, then you want to take it for the first time in the spring because you really want to give yourself the chance to actually pick up as much of that math as possible in the classroom before you try to translate things to the official test. So when I say Algebra 2 or Geometry or the equivalent integrated math course, I know from looking at our names here, we've got some Lower Merion families. That's Integrated Math 3 at Lower Merion. We have some Plymouth Whitemarsh families. That's Integrated Math 5 at Plymouth Whitemarsh. And if your school does integrated math, but I didn't just name it, then email me your school. I can look up the curriculum and let you know which course you want to be finished with. But typically, if you're in a course called pre-calc, you're good, you're done. So that's one thing an easy way to kind of know it. So like if your school goes integrated math up to a certain point, then you go into pre-calc, then you just have to finish everything before pre-calc and you'll be ready to go. So what's next? You should absolutely do SAT or ACT diagnostic testing if you haven't yet. If you've already taken something like the PSAT or the pre-ACT, then we can just test you on the other of the two. You should make a test prep plan, meaning figure out when in the year am I actually going to take this test, and then plan your prep backwards from that. And you can use my QR code here to book a 15-minute meeting with me if you want to talk through what your test prep plan should be. And then execute your test prep plan at the appropriate time. That's also on the what's next list. So that is to say this summer, if you're planning to test in the fall, or starting, November, December, January timeframe, depending on when in the spring you're planning to take the test. And with that, I'll kick it over to Eric to talk about extracurricular activities. Thank you for all of your patience while I nerded out about standardized tests.
We appreciate it. But before we move away from the subject entirely, just can't emphasize enough from even personal experience the point of if you have not taken diagnostics already, do that. When I was in high school, I was in a community where everyone defaulted to the SAT. It's a different time now. People are defaulting to the SAT for different reasons now, obviously with, digital and it's shorter and all that. But by all metrics, I seem to be the better fit for the SAT, and I was scoring fine on practice tests. And then I went on a college visit, and I was talking to an admissions representative. She said, "Have you ever looked at the ACT?" I said, "No, I haven't. And no one's even never told me about it." She said, "Every college looks at them equally. You take one or the other, you submit." And I went home and I scored the equivalent of more than 200 points better. This was back in the 1600 era, the first time around, than I ever had on an SAT. It saved so much time, energy, and stress for myself and my family. Taking 2 diagnostic tests may sound like no fun. It's playing the long game. It's essential. That's all I'll say about it.
To piggyback that last point by Eric, I cannot tell you how many families I talked to after the March SAT who had defaulted to, no, we just want to take the SAT, shorter test, shorter reading passages. My student just likes it so much better. Only to, come back from that March SAT, realize just because it feels easier doesn't mean they grade it any more easily. And then, want to explore the ACT at that point after having chosen to prepare for the SAT already. So you're going to end up saving yourself time by this investment of time up front because you just know you're committing to the test that's likely to give you better results in the long run.
Yeah, maybe we could talk for another 5-10 minutes just about that, right? Like, yeah, it's, of course it feels better sitting at a computer and having an hour, less time, than on the ACT. Doesn't mean it's the right fit. Which I'll pivot seamlessly into the fact that, I'm really excited to talk about extracurricular activities after all that data and, the grades and everything else. To me, when we look at the American admissions system for colleges and universities, I think what distinguishes our system in the best way possible is that students are looked at holistically, right? Whereas in so many other countries, it's grades and test scores and that's it. Students can have the opportunity to really be seen and valued and celebrated. And I want to give, a quick backstory of why I'm the one talking about this section and why I'm so passionate about this, because some of you I'm seeing in the participant list, probably know me and say, wait a second, don't you focus more on essays over the years? And that's true. Although in fairness, for years, I did test prep like Jim as well.
He taught me everything I know, actually.
Stop, please.
Everything I knew as of like 2000.
Now you'd school me, but when in doing essay work, the starting point to doing essays, we ask a singular question for brainstorming, which is, what do I need to know about you? And it was so awesome learning so much about all these students. They had so many cool interests and hobbies and curiosities, you name it. But one theme that I noticed over the years was that students, once they were really immersed in high school, right, or even entering high school, that transition from 8th to 9th grade, were completely losing sight of what made them really cool and what made them interesting, or quite frankly, just what made them, right, their identities. And I would be talking with them and saying, well, why don't you do this anymore? I don't know. I didn't think it was important. I didn't think it would count for college. That's a refrain I heard so many times. And it's not to say that each one of those students didn't end up having amazing essays and applications filled with wonderful accomplishments. But so many times I said to myself, wow, like they missed an opportunity to really embrace their identity and authenticity. And that ended up inspiring a TEDx talk that I gave a few years ago, where the mantra of my talk is this idea of better person, better applicant, where if you're really focused on doing things that are truly meaningful to you as a student, as an individual, and you're doing them with depth and purpose and intent, you're just going to be a happier person overall, a better person overall. And without ever thinking about the word college, you will be a better college applicant, right? Because that's what colleges want. There's this pre-prescribed notion and these myths of we have to do X, Y, and Z. And if we do that, my resume, my activity list is fulfilled. But what colleges want to see are students engaging authentically. Now, that can be in myriad forms, right? It can be intellectual pursuits, athletic talents, creative, exploration, social justice, service, civic engagement, personal interests, curiosities, hobbies. Those count. Yes, they do. Leadership, mentorship, you name it. But whatever it is, the idea is that depth is greater than breadth. Because if I'm an admissions officer, I'm sitting in the room reading your transcript, I need to be able, not just your transcript, but your whole application file. I need to be able to close my eyes by the time I'm done and really picture you in the room with me. There's a movie with Paul Rudd and Tina Fey called Admission or Acceptance. Now it's been so long, but it's where Tina Fey is a Princeton admissions officer. For two funny people, it's not a very funny movie, but there's one very striking scene where she's in the room, and as she opens every application file, the student pops up in the room with her. And that is actually a great illustration of what you can accomplish with your activities. And before Jim goes to the next slide, I do want to mention that while I'm going to reiterate this point of what's next, the reason that I want to make this such an emphasized point tonight is because this is such a pivotal moment in your student's journey in high school to pursue activities. Everyone, quote unquote, knows that they need to start thinking about an SAT, ACT prep at the end of sophomore year. Hopefully we've illuminated the right ways to do that in the most responsible and less stress inducing. But because of that, and because of the obvious natural focus on grades, activities are the thing that gets overlooked, right? It's, oh, I signed up for stuff in ninth grade. I may have sifted some stuff out and I'm on cruise control the rest of high school. I just need to fill out my summers. No, this is the time. You're halfway through, which means you have half of high school left to really develop a really meaningful, exciting resume. That means get rid of things that don't matter to you. And that means dive deeper into things that do, or perhaps you haven't had the opportunity and they're new. And that brings me to the idea of ikigai, right? Which is this Japanese word that has no direct translation to English, but the best way to translate it is that it's the intersection of what a student enjoys, what they're good at, and what the world needs. So at this juncture of high school, if this, when we do personal advising meetings with ninth and 10th graders, when I'm talking with them about activities, I always say to them, first tell me everything you do extracurricularly. I want you to list all your activities, not just school-sponsored activities, but service jobs, internships, hobbies, things you do in your spare time. Where do you like to go shopping? What YouTube channels are we watching, right? Like list it all. I want to know what you're doing. And then the next question I say is, what if these things are not really bringing you joy? What if these don't feel meaningful to you? What are you just going through the motion on? Let's get rid of it. Great. Then what do you love doing, or what haven't you gotten the chance to dive deeper into? Let's do that. Let's clear room for it, because there's only so many hours in the day. And that brings us to the idea of what should students do? What are the courses of action that can be taken right now? It's do what you love, right? We can click on the next slide, Jim, but it's the idea of doing what you love, not what seems impressive. Think about it. If everyone in the room, there's 100 people in a room, and everyone's thinking along the mindset of what does a college expect from me? What does a college want from me? All 100 people are going to end up with the same resumes. Everyone's going to be doing the same stuff. There's going to be no distinction in individuality, right? It's about doing what you love, and anything can have depth and value. Yes, even video games, but that's a separate rant for another time. But anything can have depth and value. And being authentic is your ticket to really distinguishing yourself on the application. I think there's so many surveys and studies done and articles written about what do colleges value the most. And I'm not going to sit here and dismiss those things, right? What's most important, what's least important. But one thing I would say, let's say hypothetically, right? Jim and I were having a debate, right? Like what's more important, grades and test scores or activities? If you're applying, let's just go straight to the top just to make a point here, right? If you're applying to Harvard, grades and test scores, you need, but they're not going to distinguish you. Things out of your control may distinguish you, but with what's in your control, recommendations, as Alyssa spoke about, essays, as Alyssa will speak about, and activities, which, really is the one thing that covers all 4 years of high school, right? They are not to be dismissed or overlooked. There's tremendous personal and strategic value in this. So it's so important to be authentic. But here's the thing. It's really hard to be authentic. And that idea, we can click. But that idea of, it's a crazy concept, right? On some level. And a lot of people react. They're like, what do you mean? It's hard to be authentic, right? I'm like, no. It's way easier to be basic. It's way easier to go to the school club fair, sign up for a bunch of clubs that, align with what you want, and then just go through the motions. You go after school, you do some service a couple times a year for some service fundraisers and activities, right? You do the pre-prescribed things that are right in front of you and are very accessible. That's not to say that student government or science Olympiad, or book club aren't authentic, but they aren't going to be distinguishing. They're familiar, right? We know what that essay looks like. We know without reading the activity description, at least 90% of what you've done. Being authentic is hard. Having the individual initiative and drive in this, and I don't just mean starting a club, right? It means instead of just getting a job, are you pursuing a job that aligns with you? If you have an intellectual curiosity, are you going to spend time sending emails to researching and looking up professors at different universities and then reaching out to them, and saying, hey, can I do some, virtual, contributions to your research? It's amazing. The students who actually put in the time and effort to do that, you'd be amazed how many students get positions, in those fields. These things are not unachievable. I tell every student and parent, dream big, right? And then let's figure out a plan to make it happen, right? It requires some ingenuity and creativity. You need to carve out space and time for these things. And yet so often in this high school journey, this is not what we're carving out the space and time for. These aren't the conversations and the car ride between things or at the dinner table, right? And yet this is the most important conversation. And I would argue, not just, for guiding your child through the college application process, but just as a parent, right? You want your child to be able to go into the world and pursue what's meaningful to them, with excitement and the ability to do so. So, really, now what's next? Having these conversations that I'm talking about. Build on what you've already been doing that is meaningful to you, that you love, right? Maybe, and I'm just going to paraphrase my TEDx talk, which in fairness was paraphrasing me doing presentations like this for years. But let's say your student started a band early in high school and they're just having fun in the garage. And well, now's the moment. Hey guys, why don't you play some shows? Get some paid gigs. Do some charity gigs, at some, community events. Why don't you maybe write your own songs? Why don't you teach lessons in the community? Or my favorite idea recently, just go be a troubadour, right? Go stand on the corner and open up a guitar case and get money, right? And be amazing essay. I'm sure it would lead to incredible stories. Whatever it is that you're doing already and you're loving and has a strong foundation, build on it. And whatever you're doing that you don't care about, get rid of it. Now's the time. And people will say, well, isn't it going to look bad for college? No, it's going to look way worse to a college if it's very clear that you were doing something just thinking that it looked good for college. And admissions officers are people. People know other people, right? People can read that application and they've seen this before. They've done this a long time. They know the patterns. As I was saying, go beyond school-sponsored activities if you haven't already. Again, do this with excitement, with the mindset of excitement, not obligation. Guys, summer, right? If you don't have plans this summer yet, aside from doing test prep, call Jim, scan the QR code, make a plan. If you don't have plans beyond that for this summer, now's the time to start thinking about it. And there's still time. No, don't say, oh, I missed the summer program deadlines. Now I can't do anything. No, get a job, get an internship, do your own thing. And even if you're going to overnight camp this summer, have these conversations now so that there is a plan in place and you can build momentum in the coming weeks so that you can make those visions come to life during the fall. So, this is something obviously I'm passionate about talking about. Karan, my co-founder of the company, and I love having these conversations with students. For 9th and 10th grade students, we do personal advising meetings where it's really kind of like a dream one-on-one session with your student and, you as the parent and us. And we love talking about making an academic plan and a test prep plan, but part of the conversation, a big part of it, is an extracurricular plan. So if you're listening to this and think you want to have that conversation, we're here for you. Yeah. So now I'm going to throw it to Alyssa, who's going to talk about starting to make your college list.
All right. So there may not necessarily be a secret sauce to the digital SAT, but we do have a secret sixth factor under your control when it comes to applying to colleges, and that is the college list. So while your college list may not necessarily, it doesn't affect whether or not you are accepted to a single given college or university, shaping a college list that fits your family's needs, your students' needs, that thoughtfully considers likely schools, and I'll tell you all about likely schools in a bit, can fundamentally affect the results of the college admissions process. So it's one of the things that we do love to start talking to families about. Even in, as you're wrapping up 10th grade, it's a great time to start having these conversations because there's a lot of schools. There's, the last time I looked up this number, because I like knowing it, there were 3,982 four-year degree granting institutions in the United States. That is a lot. And especially for students who may be considering, slightly more common majors, your business majors, your potential biology majors, that's not always necessarily going to be a limiting factor. If you want to study marine biology or aeronautical engineering, though, call me, I've got your list. But for most other families, you have to limit your list in some other way. That could be academic, that could be financial, but it can be things that we might consider superficial at first, because students aren't just picking a college as a place to take classes. They're picking a place where they're going to live for the next 4 years, that is going to be their home. So when we start to talk to families about building a college list, we encourage them to think about the schools match and fit. And the reason why we have these listed in the order that they are is significant for a reason. Your social fit can be, of course, are there the extracurriculars that you want to pursue? Are there the sports that you want to pursue? Does it have the vibe, the atmosphere that you're looking for? Could you see yourself living in this place for the next 4 years? Some of that is going to be physical as well. Are you looking for a big school or a small school? Do you want warm weather or cold weather? Do you want to be on a coast? Is mountain climbing your life and you're not going to a school unless you can go bouldering within a 2-hour drive? All of these things matter. Financial fit is also hugely important. Those are conversations it's important to start having as a family early on. You can look at cost of admission, cost of attendance estimators on schools to get a sense of what schools actually might cost after financial aid or merit aid discounts, or you can call Jim and ask him about those Southern schools with the grids that will give you tens of thousands of dollars for certain ACT scores. And then there's, of course, that academic component. Having a school with a strong program and a thing you want to study, or that quite simply offers the program that you want to study. All of those things can be important, but often it's going to be the non-academic things that make a a school a good fit for your student? And Eric, I think there was a story about cities and professional basketball teams that brought you to Penn.
In fairness, just professional sports teams in general, Alyssa. But yeah, when I was in high school, I grew up in a small town in Connecticut, and my parents said, Eric, you're not gonna go on a plane to go to college. I said, fine, you raised me in this really tiny town, and I'm a huge sports fan, so I'm only gonna look at colleges in big cities with professional sports teams, but not New York, because I don't like New York sports teams. And that limitation really made my college search more manageable. And there was wonderful options, reach, targets, and likelies. From top to bottom, I had options, and I still joke to this day, right? Like it's going to be pretty hard to beat how ridiculous it was, the way I built my list. But if someone called us one day and was like, I only want colleges with the color purple, as their primary school color, we can come up with a great list of schools for you too. So you got to start from somewhere, to Alyssa's point, so yeah.
It's hard for me to believe that someone would voluntarily enter Philadelphia sports fandom, since I had no say in the matter myself. That was a choice you made.
Look, you have to understand, but people assume that I fell in love with Penn for its prestige and programs, but the reality is, the first day I visited the campus, I called my mother after, and she said, how was it? I said, Mom, it's amazing. You drive over this bridge and there's the Eagles Stadium and then the Phillies Stadium, and like 10 minutes later, you're in the middle of a beautiful campus. So, I mean, look, you got to start from somewhere, right? And it led me to a place that had all the programs I wanted and needed.
And thank you for giving me the fantastic segue by mentioning reach, target, and likely. This is sort of the other set of vocabulary that you will hear school counselors, that you will hear counselors such as ourselves, that you'll hear others start to talk about when it comes to the college list, is defining schools as reach schools, target schools, and likely schools. And these terms essentially mean your chances of acceptance to a given school. And we'll unpack those terms just a little bit more. And I want to use the University of Wisconsin as an example here. So I have the University of Wisconsin's essentially academic profile for their accepted and enrolled students for the class graduating 2023-2024. And this is something that you can find for almost any college or university that you want to look up this information for. You Google University of X common data set, it's going to be section C, and it will give you all of this information so you can do exactly the same sort of, analysis that we're doing right here. So the University of Wisconsin has a middle 50th percentile. So if I lined up every single Wisconsin freshman in a row, the middle half would have SAT scores between 1370 and 1490, and an average GPA of 3.9 out of 4.0. They also have a 43% acceptance rate. A student would consider Wisconsin a likely school if their test scores met or exceeded that 75th percentile, so a 1490 or higher, and they beat the average GPA. For a student, would consider this a target school, so a school where they are a viable candidate for admission, but where admission is, it's a little bit of a toss-up, where they are going to fall in the middle between that 25th percentile and that 75th percentile. And then, student C here with a bit of a lower SAT score, a little bit of a lower GPA. In this case, we would consider University of Wisconsin a reach for them. I also want to highlight Wisconsin's 43% acceptance rate, because that is also something that's going to factor in hugely when it comes to making these sorts of evaluations. We're only going to consider a school a likely school, you know, one of those schools where you would bet money that you would get accepted to, when the acceptance rate is at least 20% or above. You could be a straight A student, you could have a 1600. If you are applying to, you know, certain schools who I probably don't need to name with those single-digit acceptance rates, you could have cured cancer. It's not going to make that school necessarily a likely school for you. In fact, those schools are going to be reach schools for everyone. So when you're starting to suss out, is a school a target, a likely, or a reach, it's an art and a science. It's something where you're going to want to consider every single factor before you make a consideration. And it's conversations that we love to have with our students. Once we have sort of these terms, we often get asked about, you know, do I need to have a balanced school list? Families often get told you should have 3 reaches, 3 targets, 3 likely schools. We tend to have a slightly different approach. To me, the likely schools, and I went to my likely school, are the most important. You want to choose likely schools that make sense for your student and your family, that still fit those academic, physical, social, financial fit questions that we discussed at the very beginning of this section. And that's going to differ from student to student. For instance, I went to Dickinson College, which ultimately ended up being one of my likely schools, but for me, it was a perfect fit. I wanted to be close enough to my family. I grew up in the Philadelphia suburbs, close enough to my family that I could go home for a weekend, not so close that my parents couldn't show up without calling me first. Sorry, mom and dad. I wanted to academically be able to study abroad in a place that wasn't Paris. It mattered to me that the school have a relatively strong creative writing program. And because it was a likely school, that financial fit became relevant as well, where because I was at that 75th percentile or above, I was offered a very substantial merit scholarship that was able to make, you know, a admittedly expensive private institution work for myself and my family. Find those likely schools, find the ones you'd be genuinely happy with, and then the rest is up to you. If you want to apply entirely to reach and targets, to reach schools after that, that's fine. But it may mean you are going to be, you know, you may hear no more often than not. So I may have talked through part of this slide already. We mentioned the common data set, but Naviance is going to be a program that most of your schools will give you access to. In some ways, this is going to be more useful than the common data set because, as Jim mentioned in his presentation about the SATs, you're going to be evaluated in your local context. So Naviance is going to have the most relevant local data. It'll give you what, you know, the profiles of students from your high school that were admitted or denied from a given institution. And when it comes to sorting out that those target schools, those reaches, those likelies, it's important to be honest with yourself. It is often fun to dream about the reach schools, the big names, the ones you see on ESPN, but have those likely schools in hand before you apply to those reach schools, simply because acceptance rates are incredibly low at this point. Often, it's one of the ways we encounter statistics in our daily life. I'll tell students, Duke's acceptance rate was 7% this year. Do you bring umbrellas with you? When it says that you have a 7% chance of rain. And we talked a little bit about our likely schools already. These are going to be schools where a student's GPA, class rank, or test scores are above the 75th percentile of accepted students. And they are insurance policies. But at the same time, I think they're the most valuable part of a college list because it allows everyone to sleep better. When your least exciting option is a great option, it sets you up to have a really successful part of the process. And Jim, you also went to one of your likely schools, right?
Yeah, that's right. I like you chased a scholarship to my likely school, and it was a great decision. I mean, I kept my college list small. I only applied to schools where I thought I'd have a very good chance of being happy. I think the important thing to remember is that a likely school is an insurance policy, but it doesn't have to be a backup plan. You should be looking forward to your time at a likely school just as much as you should at your target and reach schools. The selectivity of a school shouldn't really affect how happy you're going to be there on its own. Selectivity is a sort of artificial number that has nothing to do with your actual human experience at a college. And so for me, it was just, I would have been equally happy at one of two schools, and one ended up being a whole lot cheaper with a full tuition scholarship than the other one was. So it made my decision very easy.
And it is one of those that illustrates the importance of choosing these carefully, because although both of us sort of followed scholarships to our likely schools, you picked a much bigger campus for much different reasons. And I think even though we were both Pennsylvania students, you would have been maybe not super thrilled at Dickinson, and I would have been not super happy at Pitt.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's just the importance of picking the right one for you. We would have been miserable at each other's likely schools, but we're quite happy ourselves.
And that's one of the things that, as far as what's next for the college list, that you can start doing now. Visiting schools in your area to get a feel up for what you like or dislike. For our families in the Philadelphia area, visit Haverford College. If you don't like it, if that small liberal arts feel isn't right for you, well, there's not going to be any need to drive out to Dickinson. I can solemnly swear you're not going to like that either. Or to fly across the country to visit, Scripps or any of the other sort of small liberal arts colleges in California. You can do the same thing if you visit Drexel and you like the idea of the co-op program. Maybe Northeastern makes it onto your list. But visiting schools and getting a sense of what you like and what you don't can shape the list even for schools that you haven't visited. And the other thing really to start to do is to have conversations about the college list. What are the parameters that matter? Are they geography? Is no one getting on a plane to go to school? Is it financial? Are there certain constraints that your family has on their budget? Or are you simply going to disown your child if they end up going to, Penn State instead of Pitt?
You can tell how little Alyssa knows about college sports to think that that's still an important rivalry.
I was gonna say that it's the Ohio State families who then the kid wants to go to Michigan would be a no-brainer, or vice versa.
Yeah.
I got my PhD from Rutgers. We bought our way into the Big Ten. I don't know anything about college football. All right. So as we're coming up on the end of our presentation, I'm going to take you through the last of our 5 factors And I think we've clearly saved our best factor for last, because I get to tell you that you are still good on timing. You do not have to worry about this yet. Enjoy your summer, wrap up 10th grade strong, but maybe call us in the fall of your junior year. Because although the vast majority of work that a student may do on their essays and applications will happen in the summer between their junior and their senior year, one of the best ways to set yourself up for success and to not make that process stressful, I call it runway clearing. You take care of little bits at a time. You know, you do a little brainstorming. You fill out a couple of activity descriptions. The Common App prompts release between January and March of each year, and they've changed once in the past decade. And what this does is, by starting to work early, it allows students to build momentum so that when we get to the end of, junior year with our students, and the summer's here and everyone can breathe and finally really pick up the pace, we're not going, oh, let's start thinking about an idea. We're going, you've built momentum, you've got a rolling start. Why don't you go write me a draft? And it sets the summer up to be so much less stressful and so much less stressful and so much more successful. When it comes to how we work with students, we coach students through the essay process from the very beginning of the process. That can be talking to families about letters of recommendation, summer plans, extracurriculars, but also brainstorming, packaging, all the way through unlimited support, meetings, and feedback on every draft of every essay. We help with project management and following up and setting deadlines so that no one has to stress or sweat about that process. But most notably, the one thing that we don't do is we don't write essays for students. The most important part of any college essay, especially the personal statement, is that it is personal. And while we help students discover exactly what their voice is and exactly what stories they want to tell, it has to be their voice and their story. So we help them tell that every step of the way and structure and shape so that at the end of this process, they have essays that they are proud of that are still 100% authentically them. When it comes to Jim, you want to take this one?
Sure. So we're going to wrap up on this slide, which is basically just your end of 10th grade checklist, and we'll jump into Q&A. But the most important things to be thinking of just in this next month or month and a half, depending on where you are in the country, as school wraps up. First of all, focus on getting great grades for the rest of the school year. Second, make your plan for SAT or ACT test prep. That doesn't have to mean doing everything right now. You just need to know when the right steps are going to happen. And taking a diagnostic test sooner than later is going to be a good idea. Explore your extracurricular interests, and again, like Eric said, that doesn't always mean add. It can mean subtract to make space for what you find truly important and interesting and rewarding. And then consider setting up an essay consultation with us in the fall of junior year. So we'll start meeting with our students as early as November. So if you're interested in working with us, then kind of, get that on the calendar and we'll be ready to see you then. With all of that said, thank you so much for joining us, and we're going to jump into Q&A. So our first question is, when should you plan to test if you finished with Integrated Math 3, which is that Algebra 2 geometry equivalent in 9th grade? So what if you finished the relevant math course in 9th grade? Then when should you test? We don't typically recommend starting with test prep before, at the very earliest, the spring of 10th grade. Outside of some very specific circumstances, just because one thing that's working in your favor with standardized testing is that teenagers' brains are still growing. So you're going to just be fighting through less resistance. You're going to get better at reading as a soft skill. over that time too. Math isn't the only thing to consider here. And sometimes that reading section is a bigger barrier to student improvement than the math. So I would say in general, you'd still want to stick on a timeline where you're doing diagnostic testing during 10th grade, but you could consider doing it in the fall of 10th grade and then seeing if you have very strong scores, if it makes sense to prep in the spring of 10th grade. But for most students, it's still going to make sense to prep that summer before 11th grade. Another question: what if the student is not in the level of math yet to take diagnostic tests? Great question. So if the student is taking that algebra 2 or geometry equivalent in 11th grade, usually what we recommend doing is taking a diagnostic ACT in the fall around when you take the PSAT, because you'll get that score back from the PSAT in November. And at that point, if you have an ACT diagnostic score, it's a great time for us to make a plan for the spring SAT or ACT. So if you're on that later timeline, you can also delay the diagnostic testing. Generally speaking, not having the math will affect both tests equally, so you can also knock the diagnostics out earlier. It's more of a style of presentation between the two tests that would make the difference than specific content material on the tests that's different. Most of that actual underlying content is the same. So you have the option to wait, or you can do it early. Both ways are equally valid, because there's no rush if you're not testing until the spring, because you're not going to start prep until later in the fall at the earliest anyway. All right, another question. All of our questions are about standardized testing. So if you guys have, maybe I was just more confusing than Eric and Alyssa, I don't know. Applying to a school that is truly test optional, how do you decide whether or not to submit your scores? Great question. First of all, let me say, if you work with us on test prep, then that's something that we throw in as an add-on. I will help you with the decision. And same with if you work with us on essays but not test prep, then I'm still going to be the one by proxy of your coach to help with that decision. If you ask them and it's a tricky decision, then I might help them kind of suss through it as well. But it's very context dependent. So there's so much that goes into it. There's the percentage of admitted students who submitted SAT and ACT scores. There is, what that school's averages are, that middle 50% that Alyssa alluded to. I would say, generally speaking, if you're above a school's 25th percentile, you typically want to send the score. If it's below that 25th percentile, there are situations where you would, situations where you wouldn't. Generally speaking, I tend to advise that anyone scoring above about a 1400 or a 32, 33 on the ACT, submit it more or less to any school. There are exceptions there, but you're really going to want to send that most places, because colleges aren't assuming you're just below their averages when you're submitting that test score. They're not giving you the benefit of the doubt when that score is absent. And those scores still are strong scores. I know we live in a day and age where the average scores at colleges are just growing. And, there's this kind of rat race mentality that goes around the schools and students stressing each other out. Those are strong scores that tell a college that you are ready to show up on campus and be successful and do the work. So the decision can be quite complicated, but that's just some of my kind of very general advice. There are more very specific context dependent things that can come into it, though. And then finally, if you want to do well on the PSAT for national merit, is it still worth possibly doing ACT, which then forces a student to study for both? So you should still absolutely take diagnostic testing. And one thing about preparing for the PSAT for national merit is I get a lot of calls from people who want to do that. And often it's the case that the sophomore year PSAT score wasn't in a place where it really is a wise decision to try for. And just to give an example, I mean, we have never had a student qualify for national merit whose 10th grade diagnostic SAT or PSAT was below a 1300. So sometimes parents will call, student has a 1250, really strong in the classroom. They ask me, what do you think? And I tell them honestly, we're happy to help you try, of course, but we've never seen it from a student with a baseline score this low. And that's not to say that a 1250 is a low baseline score, first of all. That is a very strong baseline score. So I think when you're over that 1300 mark, it can make sense to try. But if your diagnostic ACT score, let's say you were just above that 1300 mark, if your diagnostic ACT score is much higher than that, then you have this decision to make where you have a very long and drawn out prep process that may be successful, maybe not, for national merit. And if you have a bad day on the wrong day, you're not going to get it, because the digital SAT has so few questions that really missing one or two and your chance is done. If you have an ACT score such that you could do a little bit of prep and get like a 99th percentile ACT score, then you might consider that. So I absolutely still recommend doing an ACT diagnostic test so that you're making the decision with a full view of all of the information. That doesn't necessarily mean you won't be going for national merit. It's just that you need all of the actual context to make the proper decision for the student. All right. Thank you, everybody, so much for attending. We really appreciate it. We will send out a diagnostic test along with a link to the YouTube recording of this webinar. So feel free to share it with any friends or family or students if you're watching without a parent, or parents if you're watching it without a student and you want them to tune in. That link will be live for as long as you need it. So thank you all so much and have a good night. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Night.